In the chaos of war, heroes aren't born from following orders. They're forged in the moment when someone chooses to break them. This is the story of a woman who heard "fall back" echoing across a battlefield in Afghanistan, saw her wounded teammates bleeding in the sand, and made a decision that would either save lives or end her own. What happens when training meets raw human instinct? When military protocol crashes against moral courage?
When a single person stands between life and death for an entire unit? Some stories are about following commands.
This one is about the courage to ignore them when everything that matters hangs in the balance. This is about the day one woman proved that heroism isn't about rank, gender, or permission. It's about the split-second decision to run toward danger when everyone else is running away. In the mountains of Afghanistan, under enemy fire, surrounded by chaos, she heard those words that should have sent her retreating. Instead, she did something that would change military history forever.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her gear one final time. The weight of her medical pack felt familiar against her shoulders, each piece of equipment positioned exactly where muscle memory demanded it should be.
Around her, 12 Navy SEALs conducted their final equipment checks with the methodical precision that had kept them alive through countless missions in this unforgiving terrain. Maria had been serving as a combat medic, attached to SEAL Team 6 for 8 months now, long enough to earn the grudging respect of men who initially questioned whether a woman belonged in their tight-knit brotherhood. She had proven herself time and again, treating wounds under fire, keeping wounded warriors alive long enough to reach evacuation points, and never once asking for special treatment or easier assignments. The mission briefing had been straightforward in the way that military operations rarely were once bullets started flying. Intelligence indicated a high-value target was holed up in a compound roughly 15 kilometers northeast of their current position. The target was believed to be a bomb maker responsible for improvised explosive devices that had killed dozens of coalition forces over the past 6 months. The operation was designated as capture or kill, with preference given to bringing the target back alive for interrogation. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the team leader, gathered his men around a detailed terrain map spread across a flat boulder. His weathered face showed the strain of multiple deployments, but his eyes remained sharp and focused as he traced their planned route with a gloved finger.
"Listen up," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "We've got a 12-click movement through some of the nastiest terrain this country has to offer.
Intelligence suggests minimal enemy presence between here and the target compound, but we all know how reliable that information tends to be." The team clustered around the map, each member studying the route and identifying potential challenges. Maria noticed the narrow canyon approach to the target area, a natural choke point that could easily become a killing field if they encountered resistance. Her medical training had taught her to always consider worst-case scenarios, and this terrain offered plenty of opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, pointed to a ridgeline overlooking their planned approach. "Sir, if they've got spotters up there, we'll be walking into a trap long before we reach the compound. That's why we're taking the long way around. We'll approach from the south, use the creek bed for concealment, then scale the back wall of the compound under cover of darkness." The plan was solid, built on the kind of tactical expertise that had made SEAL teams legendary. But Maria had learned during her time with these warriors that no plan survived first contact with the enemy unchanged. She double-checked her medical supplies, ensuring she had enough bandages, morphine, and blood-clotting agents to handle multiple casualties. As they began their movement toward the target, Maria fell into position near the center of the formation, close enough to reach any wounded team member quickly, but protected by the firepower of the SEALs around her. The terrain was everything the briefing had promised and worse. Loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot, hidden crevices that could snap an ankle, and an altitude that left even these supremely conditioned warriors breathing hard. The first few hours of movement passed without incident. The team moved with the fluid grace of men who had trained together for years, communicating through hand signals and maintaining the kind of tactical awareness that kept them alive in hostile territory. Maria found herself impressed, as she always was, by their professionalism and dedication to their mission. But as they approached the narrow canyon that would funnel them toward their objective, the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Rodriguez, monitoring enemy communications frequencies, held up a closed fist, the signal for immediate halt. The team froze in place, weapons ready, every sense straining to detect potential threats.
"Multiple enemy positions," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Looks like they knew we were coming." Morrison's jaw tightened as he processed this information.
Intelligence failures were unfortunately common in this theater of operations, but that didn't make them any less deadly when you were the one walking into an ambush. He signaled for the team to take defensive positions, while he considered their options. The canyon ahead was the only practical route to their objective, but it was also perfect terrain for an ambush. High walls on both sides would limit their movement options while giving enemy fighters elevated firing positions. Alternative routes would add days to their mission timeline and take them through even more dangerous territory. We push through, Morrison decided after a tense consultation with his senior team members.
Fast and hard. If they want to fight, we'll give them one they won't forget.
The decision was characteristic of SEAL philosophy. When faced with overwhelming odds, attack with such ferocity and precision that the enemy never has a chance to organize an effective response. But Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as she considered the medical challenges of treating casualties in such confined terrain.
As they entered the canyon, the walls seemed to close in around them like the jaws of some massive predator. The only sound was the soft crunch of their boots on loose gravel and the distant whisper of wind through the rock formations above.
Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, every outcropping could conceal a sniper's position. They had covered roughly half the distance through the canyon when the first shots rang out.
Muzzle flashes erupted from positions high on both canyon walls, as automatic weapons fire poured down on the trapped SEAL team. The sound was deafening in the confined space, echoing off the rock walls, and creating a cacophony of noise that made communication nearly impossible.
Contact left, contact right, Morrison shouted over the gunfire, his voice barely audible above the chaos.
Find cover and return fire. The team scattered, each man seeking whatever protection the rocky terrain could provide. Maria pressed herself against a large boulder, her heart pounding as bullets whined overhead and chipped fragments of stone from the canyon walls.
Around her, the SEALs were doing what they did best, methodically identifying enemy positions and returning accurate, devastating fire. But the enemy had chosen their ambush site well.
The high ground gave them significant advantages in both protection and fields of fire. Every time one of the SEALs exposed himself to engage a target, multiple enemy fighters could bring their weapons to bear on his position. The firefight raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Maria could hear Morrison coordinating the team's response over the radio, calling for air support and attempting to organize a fighting withdrawal from their exposed position. But she could also hear something that chilled her to the bone. The unmistakable sounds of wounded men calling for help. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Kim had taken a bullet through the shoulder and was bleeding heavily behind a pile of rocks about 30 meters from Maria's position. She could see him trying to apply pressure to the wound with one hand while continuing to return fire with the other. But she knew from experience that he would lose consciousness from blood loss within minutes without immediate medical attention. Even worse, she could see Petty Officer First Class Mike Johnson lying motionless in an exposed position near the canyon wall. Whether he was dead, unconscious, or simply pinned down by enemy fire, she couldn't tell from her position, but he needed immediate evaluation and treatment. "Doc!" Kim called out, using the nickname all the team members had adopted for her. "I need some help over here." Maria assessed the tactical situation with the cold calculation that her training had drilled into her. To reach Kim's position, she would need to cross roughly 30 meters of open ground under direct observation from multiple enemy positions. The canyon floor offered virtually no cover, and the enemy fighters had already demonstrated their marksmanship by hitting multiple team members despite the difficult shooting angles. Standard military doctrine was clear in situations like this. Medical personnel were not expected to expose themselves to unnecessary risk. Her job was to treat wounded personnel after they had been moved to secure positions or after the immediate threat had been neutralized. No one would criticize her for waiting until the SEALs had suppressed the enemy positions enough to allow safe movement. But doctrine didn't account for the reality of watching men she had served alongside for months bleeding to death while she remained in relative safety. Kim was losing blood fast, and Johnson might already be dying in his exposed position. Every second of delay reduced their chances of survival. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible above the continued gunfire. "All units, fall back. I repeat, fall back to secondary positions." The order was tactically sound. The team was outnumbered and outgunned in an extremely disadvantageous position. A fighting withdrawal would allow them to reach more defensible terrain while maintaining their ability to engage the enemy. Air support was en route and could provide the firepower needed to even the odds once the team had moved to a safer location. But falling back meant abandoning Kim and Johnson to their fate. Even if they survived the enemy assault, they would likely bleed to death before the team could return to retrieve them. Maria looked at Kim's increasingly pale face and Johnson's motionless form,
and knew that following orders meant watching two good men die. She had joined the military to save lives, not to watch helplessly while wounded soldiers died, because helping them was too dangerous. Her medical oath demanded that she provide aid to anyone who needed it, regardless of personal risk. But more than that, these weren't just any soldiers. They were her teammates, men who had accepted her as one of their own and would unhesitatingly risk their lives to save hers.
The sounds of the firefight seemed to fade into background noise as Maria made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She checked her medical supplies one final time, took a deep breath of the thin mountain air, and prepared to do something that violated every tactical principle she had ever been taught.
"Fall back," she heard Morrison shout again, his voice carrying a note of increasing urgency as enemy fire intensified around their positions. Instead of retreating with the rest of the team, Maria Santos sprinted directly toward the enemy positions, her medical bag bouncing against her back as she ran through the kill zone to reach her wounded teammates. Behind her, she could hear voices shouting in alarm and disbelief, but she was already committed to her course of action. The enemy fighters, apparently as surprised as anyone by her sudden appearance in the open, took several precious seconds to adjust their aim to this new target. Those seconds made all the difference as Maria dove behind the rocks where Kim was taking cover, her hands already reaching for the medical supplies that might keep him alive. "What the hell are you doing here, Doc?" Kim gasped, his face gray with pain and blood loss.
"My job," Maria replied grimly, already working to stop the bleeding from his shoulder wound.
"Now shut up and let me work."
Around them, the canyon erupted in renewed gunfire as both sides realized that the game had suddenly changed. The woman who was supposed to retreat had instead chosen to advance, and her decision was about to set in motion a chain of events that would test every member of the team in ways they had never imagined. The moment Maria Santos reached Kim's position, muscle memory and training took over completely.
Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she tore open his uniform to assess the wound, her mind automatically cataloging the damage while bullets continued to crack overhead. The enemy round had entered through his shoulder and exited cleanly, missing major arteries but causing significant tissue damage and blood loss. "This is going to hurt," she warned Kim as she applied a hemostatic agent directly to the wound channel. The chemical compound would help clot his blood rapidly, but the application process was excruciating for wounded soldiers already dealing with significant trauma. Kim gritted his teeth and continued returning fire with his good arm, his shooting rhythm never faltering despite the pain. "Doc, you shouldn't have come out here. This position is completely exposed."
Maria had already noticed that uncomfortable fact.
The pile of rocks that provided Kim with some protection from enemy fire was barely large enough for one person, and it offered no concealment from the elevated positions where most of the enemy fighters had established themselves. Every few seconds, bullets struck the rocks around them, sending sharp fragments of stone flying in all directions. But her immediate concern wasn't their tactical situation. It was the fact that Johnson was still lying motionless in an even more exposed position roughly 20 meters away. From her new vantage point, she could see that he was alive but unconscious, probably from a head wound that had left him unable to seek cover or return fire. "Kim, I need you to provide covering fire while I get to Johnson," she said, applying a pressure bandage to his shoulder wound with swift, sure movements. "Absolutely not," Kim replied firmly. "You've already taken enough risks getting this far. Morrison is going to have my ass if I let you go charging across open ground again." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Morrison's voice crackled over their radio headsets. "Santos, what the hell do you think you're doing? I gave you a direct order to fall back with the rest of the team." Maria keyed her radio while continuing to work on Kim's injuries.
"Sir, I have 2 wounded personnel who will die without immediate medical attention. I'm not abandoning them. Negative."
"You will withdraw to a secure position immediately. That's an order." The radio exchange was interrupted by a sustained burst of automatic weapons fire from one of the enemy positions, forcing both Maria and Kim to press themselves against the rocks, as bullets whined inches above their heads.
When the firing stopped, Maria could hear Morrison coordinating the team's tactical response from his position further back in the canyon. "Rodriguez, can you get a clear shot on that machine gun position?" "Thompson, work your way around to the left flank and see if you can find a way up those canyon walls." The SEALs were doing what they had been trained to do, adapt to changing circumstances and execute complex tactical maneuvers under extreme pressure. But Maria knew that even their legendary skills might not be enough to suppress all the enemy positions before Kim and Johnson bled to death. She finished stabilizing Kim's shoulder wound as best she could under the circumstances, using a combat application tourniquet to control bleeding while preserving as much function as possible. "You're going to be fine," she told him.
but you need to get back to the team's position for proper treatment.
I'm not leaving you out here alone, Kim insisted. You don't have a choice. You're losing too much blood to stay effective, and I need someone to tell Morrison exactly where Johnson is positioned so the team can provide better covering fire. Before Kim could argue further, Maria was moving again.
She had spotted a narrow gully that ran parallel to the canyon wall, offering a concealed route that would get her most of the way to Johnson's position. It would still require crossing several meters of open ground, but it was better than attempting a direct assault across the canyon floor. The gully was deeper than it had appeared from her previous position, allowing her to move in a low crouch, rather than crawling on her belly, but it was also filled with loose rocks and debris that made silent movement impossible. Every step she took seemed to send small avalanches of stone clattering down the slope, potentially alerting enemy fighters to her location. Above her, the firefight continued with undiminished intensity. She could hear the distinctive crack of American-made rifles as the SEALs engaged targets, punctuated by the heavier reports of enemy AK-47s and machine guns. Occasionally, the sharp whistle of a rocket-propelled grenade would cut through the other sounds, followed by the thunderous explosion as it struck the canyon walls. As she moved through the gully, Maria began to understand the full scope of the tactical situation they faced. The enemy had established interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to the compound, and they had positioned observers who could call in reinforcements if needed.
This wasn't a hastily organized ambush. It was a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate an entire SEAL team. She reached the end of the concealed route and found herself facing the most dangerous part of her journey.
Johnson was lying behind a low stone wall that had once been part of an ancient structure, but the wall only provided protection from one direction. Enemy fighters positioned on the opposite canyon wall had clear lines of sight to his location. Maria studied the terrain carefully, looking for any feature that might provide even minimal concealment during her crossing. A shallow depression in the canyon floor offered the possibility of approaching Johnson's position from an unexpected angle, but using it would require perfect timing to avoid enemy observation. She keyed her radio, hoping Morrison would respond, despite his obvious anger at her previous decision. Actual, this is Santos. I need coordinated suppressive fire on the East Canyon wall in 30 seconds. I'm making my final approach to Johnson's position. There was a long pause before Morrison responded, and she could hear the frustration in his voice. Santos, I am ordering you to withdraw immediately. I will not authorize fire support for this operation. Then I'll do it without authorization. Maria replied calmly. Johnson is dying, and I'm the only one who can save him. She switched her radio to the team frequency and addressed all the SEALs directly. All units, this is Doc. I'm going after Johnson whether I have official support or not. If you want to help, put some rounds on the east wall starting in 20 seconds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every SEAL position opened fire simultaneously, pouring hundreds of rounds at the enemy fighters on the East Canyon wall. The concentrated firepower forced the enemy to take cover, giving Maria the window of opportunity she needed. She sprinted across the open ground in a zigzagging pattern, changing direction every few steps to make herself a more difficult target. Behind her, she could hear Morrison screaming orders over the radio, but his words were lost in the thunderous noise of the sustained firefight. The 20 meters to Johnson's position felt like 20 miles, but Maria's legs pumped with adrenaline-fueled strength as bullets whined past her head and struck the ground around her feet. One round passed so close that she felt the heat of its passage against her cheek, but she never slowed her desperate sprint toward her wounded teammate. She dove the final few feet, rolling behind the stone wall just as enemy fire began to concentrate on her new position. Johnson was unconscious but breathing, a significant head wound, bleeding steadily from where a bullet had creased his skull above his left ear. The injury looked worse than it actually was. Head wounds always bled heavily, but he had lost enough blood to cause unconsciousness and would die without immediate treatment. Working quickly, Maria cleaned the wound and applied a field dressing designed to control bleeding while protecting the brain from further trauma. Johnson's vital signs were weak but stable, and she was confident he would survive if they could get him to proper medical facilities within the next few hours. But that was easier said than done. Their current position was completely exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions, and Johnson was too heavy for her to move alone while under fire. Even worse, enemy fighters were beginning to maneuver for better positions, and she could hear shouted commands in the local dialect as they coordinated their assault.
"Johnson!" she called, hoping the sound of her voice might penetrate his unconscious state.
Mike, I need you to wake up. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but definitely aware. Doc? What? Where am I? You're in a world of trouble, Maria replied with grim humor. But you're alive, and that's what matters. Can you move?
Johnson tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back against the stone wall, his face pale with nausea and disorientation. Everything's spinning. I think I'm going to be sick. The symptoms were consistent with a concussion, which meant his condition could deteriorate rapidly without proper monitoring. Maria knew they had to get him back to the team's position quickly, but moving a disoriented patient through a firefight presented challenges she had never faced before. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice, and for the first time since the firefight began, he sounded genuinely concerned rather than angry. "Santos, what's your status? We've got movement on both flanks, and it looks like they're bringing up heavy weapons."
Maria keyed her radio while continuing to monitor Johnson's condition. "I've got Johnson stabilized, but he's got a serious concussion and can't move under his own power."
"I need someone to help me get him back to your position." "Negative. The entire area between our positions is under direct enemy observation. Any movement will draw concentrated fire." As if to emphasize Morrison's point, a rocket-propelled grenade struck the canyon wall directly above their position, showering them with rock fragments and dust. The explosion was so close that Maria felt the concussion wave in her chest, and Johnson cried out in pain as the noise aggravated his head injury. "Sir, we can't stay here," Maria radioed back.
"They're zeroing in on our position and Johnson needs immediate evacuation." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters were maneuvering to positions that would allow them to engage Maria and Johnson with direct fire, while others were moving to cut off any possible retreat routes.
The SEALs were fighting magnificently, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Morrison made the decision that would either save his team or destroy it. All units were going to execute a frontal assault on the enemy positions. "Santos, when you hear sustained fire from all our positions, you move Johnson back to the rally point as fast as you can manage."
"Sir, that's suicide." Rodriguez protested over the radio. "They've got us outnumbered 3-1, and they're in prepared positions. It's the only way to get our people out alive," Morrison replied grimly.
"Prepare for assault in 60 seconds. Maria looked down at Johnson, who was struggling to remain conscious despite his injuries. Around them, enemy fire was intensifying as more fighters moved into position for what would probably be the final phase of the battle. In 60 seconds, 12 Navy SEALs would launch themselves against overwhelming odds to give her and Johnson a chance to survive. She had already violated orders by advancing into enemy fire instead of retreating. Now she faced an even more difficult decision. Would she allow her teammates to sacrifice themselves for her safety, or would she find another way to save everyone? The answer came to her with startling clarity. She had not come this far and risked this much to watch good men die for her decisions. If the SEALs were going to make their assault anyway, she would find a way to even the odds and give them a fighting chance.
Johnson was conscious enough to handle his weapon, even if he couldn't move effectively. The enemy fighters were so focused on the SEAL positions that they might not expect effective resistance from what they probably assumed was a single wounded soldier behind the stone wall. "Mike," she said urgently, "I need you to listen carefully. In about 40 seconds, the team is going to assault the enemy positions.
When that happens, I need you to provide covering fire for as long as you can manage." "What about you?" Johnson asked groggily.
Maria checked her sidearm and the few grenades she carried for personal protection. They weren't much against trained fighters in prepared positions, but they might be enough to create the distraction the SEALs needed. "I'm going to do something stupid," she replied with a grim smile. "But if it works, we might all get out of this alive." The countdown to the SEAL assault felt like an eternity to Maria as she prepared for what might be the final moments of her life.
She had positioned herself at the edge of the stone wall that protected Johnson, her sidearm ready, and 2 fragmentation grenades clipped to her vest within easy reach. The plan forming in her mind was simple, desperate, and probably suicidal, but it might give her teammates the edge they needed to survive. Enemy fighters had moved into positions roughly 50 meters uphill from her location, close enough that she could hear their voices as they coordinated their defensive preparations. They clearly expected the Americans to attempt some kind of fighting withdrawal, and they were positioning themselves to cut off any escape routes while maintaining devastating fields of fire on the canyon floor. What they didn't expect was a lone combat medic armed with nothing more than a pistol and absolute determination to assault their positions. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, with 30 seconds remaining until the assault. "All units, final weapons check. Santos, acknowledge that you understand the plan." Maria keyed her radio one last time, knowing that what she was about to say would probably end her military career if she survived the next few minutes. "Actual, I understand the plan, but I'm not following it. I'm going to create a diversion on the east flank. Execute your assault when you hear my grenades detonate." "Negative. Santos, you will follow orders and..." Maria switched off her radio, cutting off Morrison's increasingly frantic protests. She had made her decision, and nothing anyone could say would change her mind now. The only thing that mattered was giving her teammates every possible advantage in the desperate fight that was about to begin. She looked down at Johnson, who was struggling to maintain focus despite his concussion. "Mike, when the shooting starts, you keep your head down and provide covering fire for the team. Don't worry about me, just keep them alive." "Doc, whatever you're planning, don't do it," Johnson pleaded. "We can find another way." "There is no other way," Maria replied firmly. "The team is going to get chewed up if they assault those positions without some kind of diversion. This is the only chance we have." Before Johnson could argue further, Maria was moving. She sprinted along the base of the canyon wall, using every scrap of cover available as she worked her way toward the enemy positions. Her movement was necessarily noisy on the loose shale, but the ongoing firefight masked most of the sound as both sides continued to exchange intermittent shots. The terrain worked in her favor as she climbed toward the enemy positions. Centuries of erosion had carved numerous gullies and crevices in the rock face, providing concealment for someone willing to take the time to move carefully. But time was something Maria didn't have. Morrison would launch his assault with or without her diversion, and every second of delay increased the chances that her teammates would be walking into a slaughter. She reached a position roughly 30 meters below the main enemy defensive line, close enough to hear individual voices and see muzzle flashes when the fighters engaged targets in the canyon below. There were at least 8 enemy positions visible from her location, with probably more hidden in the rocky terrain above. The fragmentation grenades she carried had an effective casualty radius of 5 meters and could cause injuries up to 15 meters from the point of detonation. Used properly, they could disrupt the enemy's defensive coordination long enough for the SEALs to close the distance and engage with their superior training and individual marksmanship. But getting close enough to use the grenades effectively would require exposing herself to direct fire from multiple enemy positions. Even if she survived long enough to detonate both weapons, she would be completely exposed to retaliation with no hope of reaching safety before the enemy recovered from the surprise. Maria had joined the military to save lives, not to take them. But sometimes saving the lives of good people required eliminating those who threatened them. She pulled the pin on her first grenade, counted down the timing carefully, and hurled it toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. The explosion was devastating in the confined space of the rocky terrain. The grenade detonated in the center of a 3-man fighting position, killing 2 fighters instantly and wounding the third so severely that his screams echoed off the canyon walls. But more importantly, the unexpected attack from their flank threw the entire enemy defense into confusion. Fighters who had been carefully positioned to engage targets in the canyon below suddenly found themselves under attack from a completely unexpected direction. Some attempted to turn their weapons toward Maria's position, while others maintained their original fields of fire in case this was merely a diversion for the main assault. Their confusion was exactly what Maria had hoped for. She sprinted toward another enemy position, her second grenade already in her hand with the pin pulled. This time she was close enough to throw the weapon directly into the fighting position, and the resulting explosion eliminated 3 more enemy fighters while wounding several others. But her attack had also revealed her position to every surviving enemy fighter on the mountainside. Automatic weapons fire began to converge on her location from multiple directions, forcing her to take cover behind a large boulder that provided minimal protection from the increasingly accurate incoming fire. The sound of her grenades detonating had been Morrison's signal to launch the SEAL assault. She could hear the distinctive crack of American rifles as the team began their uphill advance, but she could also hear enemy fighters attempting to coordinate their response to the unexpected 2-front battle. Position 3. Engage the woman on the east flank. Positions 1 and 2 maintain fire on the main assault. The enemy commander was trying to divide his forces between Maria's diversion and Morrison's assault, exactly the tactical mistake she had hoped to provoke. But she was also drawing concentrated fire from at least 4 different positions, and the boulder that protected her was being steadily reduced to rubble by sustained automatic weapons fire. Her sidearm was virtually useless at the ranges she was facing, but Maria began returning fire anyway. She wasn't trying to hit specific targets. She was simply trying to keep enemy heads down and maintain the impression that she represented a significant threat to their positions. Each time she exposed herself to fire, bullets struck the rocks around her with increasing accuracy. The enemy fighters were beginning to find the range, and several rounds passed close enough that she could feel their passage through the air. It was only a matter of time before one of them found its mark. But her diversion was working. She could hear Morrison's voice over her radio headset, which she had forgotten to turn off completely, as he coordinated the SEAL advance. "Thompson, take your fire team left. Rodriguez, Suppress that machine gun position. We've got them confused. Keep pushing. The sounds of battle were shifting as the SEALs closed the distance to the enemy positions. Instead of the long-range exchange of fire that had characterized the initial contact, she was beginning to hear the close-range crack of rifles and the occasional detonation of grenades as the team engaged individual fighting positions. But Maria's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Enemy fire was so intense that she couldn't raise her head above the rocks without immediately drawing accurate shots from multiple directions. The boulder that protected her was being steadily chipped away, and she could see pieces of stone flying past her position with each impact.
Worse, she was beginning to hear movement in the rocks above. Her position, enemy fighters were maneuvering to get behind her, and once they achieved that position, her improvised cover would become a death trap.
She had perhaps minutes before they could establish firing positions that would allow them to engage her from multiple angles simultaneously. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She had disobeyed direct orders to save the lives of her teammates, and now she was about to die alone on a mountainside in Afghanistan while they continued their assault on the enemy positions. If she had followed Morrison's original order to fall back, she would be safely behind American lines instead of facing certain death in a hopeless tactical position. But Kim and Johnson would be dead, and the SEAL assault would probably have failed with heavy casualties. Sometimes the right choice wasn't the safe choice, and sometimes saving lives required risking your own. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice, and she could hear genuine concern through the static and background noise of ongoing combat. Santos! Santos, respond. What's your status? Maria keyed her radio while bullets continued to strike the rocks around her position.
I'm pinned down on the east flank, sir. Multiple enemy positions have me under direct fire, and they're trying to flank my position. Hold your position, Doc. We're almost through their main line. Rodriguez is bringing his fire team to your location. The knowledge that help was coming gave Maria new determination to survive the next few minutes. She began to move more aggressively, using brief lulls in enemy fire to change positions and keep her attackers guessing about her exact location. Each movement was a calculated risk, but staying motionless would simply allow the enemy to concentrate their fire and eventually overwhelm her position. She could hear Rodriguez's team approaching from below, their movement marked by the distinctive sound of American weapons engaging targets. But she could also hear enemy fighters calling out directions to each other as they attempted to coordinate their assault on her position.
The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate gamble had saved her team or simply delayed their destruction by a few precious moments. But as Maria Santos prepared for what might be her final firefight, she felt no regret for the decisions that had brought her to this place. She had sworn an oath to preserve life, and she had honored that oath even when it required violating direct orders and risking her own survival. Whether she lived or died in the next few minutes, she had given her teammates their best chance to complete their mission and return home to their families. The sound of approaching friendly forces grew louder as Rodriguez's fire team fought their way up the mountainside toward her position. Above her, enemy fighters were still attempting to maneuver for better firing positions, but their coordination was breaking down under the pressure of fighting on multiple fronts. Maria checked her remaining ammunition and prepared for the final phase of a battle that had begun with a simple choice: follow orders and watch good men die, or disobey orders and give them a chance to live. She had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences with the same courage that had carried her into enemy fire to save her wounded teammates. The mountain battlefield erupted in renewed gunfire as American and enemy forces clashed in the rocky terrain, but Maria Santos held her position and continued fighting. She had advanced when ordered to fall back, had attacked when outnumbered and outgunned, and had risked everything to save the lives of men who had become her brothers in arms. When Rodriguez's team finally reached her position 20 minutes later, they found her wounded but alive, still returning fire at enemy positions despite multiple injuries. Kim and Johnson were evacuated safely, and the entire SEAL team survived an engagement that should have resulted in catastrophic casualties. Her actions that day would earn Maria Santos the Silver Star for gallantry in action, making her one of the first women to receive the award for direct ground combat. But more importantly, 12 Navy SEALs would go home to their families because one combat medic chose courage over caution when it mattered most. In the official after-action reports, military analysts would study her tactical decisions and debate whether her disobedience of direct orders set a dangerous precedent for military discipline. But for the men whose lives she saved, there was no debate at all. Sometimes the right choice isn't the safe choice. Sometimes saving lives requires risking your own. And sometimes the greatest acts of heroism begin with two simple words: fall back, and the courage to do exactly the opposite.